The weather report was reassuring. Cloud cover would be heavy, visibility poor, seas unsettled but manageable. For warships operating under constant threat from air attack, that forecast meant safety, nature itself acting as concealment. The fleet adjusted accordingly. Sailing schedules were confirmed, routes were cleared. Lookouts relaxed just enough to believe that the enemy would stay grounded, blind, and distant. In naval warfare, weather was often treated as an equalizer, sometimes even a shield. But this time, the weather did not protect them. It betrayed them. As the ships advanced beneath low clouds and shifting winds, they crossed an invisible boundary. The sea looked empty. The sky looked hostile to aircraft. Everything about the conditions suggested caution, but not danger. What the commanders did not know was that the same weather they trusted had been studied, anticipated, and quietly weaponized. They were not sailing under cover. They were sailing into a trap. By the middle years of World War II, weather had become a critical operational factor in naval planning. Radar was still limited. Aircraft range was constrained. Visual detection remained decisive. Poor weather could ground air power, disrupt reconnaissance, and protect surface fleets from discovery. Entire operations were delayed or launched based on forecasts. Commanders relied heavily on meteorological intelligence. Forecasts were compiled from sparse data, ship observations, island stations, and incomplete atmospheric models. Accuracy varied, but once a forecast was issued, it shaped everything: routes, formations, speed, and timing. Enemy planners understood this reliance. They knew that fleets trusted weather not just for safety, but for permission to move, to expose themselves, to concentrate forces without fear of detection. In several theaters, navies learned to exploit this dependency. Air forces trained to fly in marginal conditions. Reconnaissance units learned to operate at the edge of visibility. And surface forces began timing movements to coincide with moments when the enemy believed weather made attack impossible. The danger was subtle. Weather was not false intelligence. It was incomplete intelligence. A forecast might accurately describe conditions in one area, but fail to account for how the enemy would interpret, exploit, or override those conditions. By trusting the forecast too completely, commanders risk surrendering initiative to an opponent who viewed the same clouds not as an obstacle, but as camouflage. This is where the trap formed. Not through deception orders or false signals, but through assumptions shared by everyone who believed the weather dictated what could and could not be done. And when those assumptions were wrong, fleets found themselves exposed in the worst possible way: confident, committed, and already too deep to turn back. The ships involved were not careless. They followed procedure. They trusted professional forecasts. They adjusted tactics exactly as doctrine advised. The mistake was not believing the weather report. The mistake was believing the enemy believed it too. What followed would demonstrate that in modern naval warfare, the most dangerous trap is not one built with mines or guns, but one built on shared expectations. The fleet that trusted the weather belonged to the German Kriegsmarine. The operation was Operation Regenbogen, launched in December 1942, aimed at destroying an Allied Arctic convoy bound for the Soviet Union. The convoy, JW-51B, was part of the perilous Arctic supply route, threading through ice, darkness, and violent seas to deliver tanks, aircraft, and ammunition desperately needed on the Eastern Front. German naval planners believed conditions favored them. Weather forecasts predicted low cloud ceilings, snow squalls, and poor visibility across the Barents Sea. Such conditions, they believed, would limit British air intervention and prevent long-range reconnaissance from interfering with a surface attack. The Germans were not reckless. They assembled a powerful surface force, the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Lützow, supported by 6 destroyers. The plan was methodical: split forces, draw off escorts, annihilate the convoy, withdraw before superior Allied forces could respond. Everything depended on weather and forced isolation. If visibility stayed poor, the British would be blind. Their cruisers would not arrive in time. The Germans would strike fast, decisively, and vanish back into the Arctic darkness. What German command did not account for was how the Royal Navy had learned to fight inside weather, not avoid it. British commanders received the same meteorological reports. They saw the same low-pressure systems, the same snow, the same darkness. But they did not interpret the weather as protection. They interpreted it as inevitability. The Royal Navy understood that German surface raiders depended on weather to compensate for Allied numerical superiority. When forecasts predicted poor visibility, British commanders did not relax, they reinforced. Convoy JW-51B sailed with a modest escort of destroyers and corvettes, but critically, 2 light cruisers, HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, were positioned nearby, deliberately obscured by weather. British radar capabilities had matured by late 1942. Unlike earlier phases of the war, they no longer relied solely on visual contact. Poor visibility limited German gunnery more than British detection. This asymmetry mattered. German commanders assumed that poor weather reduced all situational awareness equally. In reality, it reduced only theirs. The British were not chasing the weather. They were hiding inside it. On the morning of December 31, German forces made contact with the convoy. At first, everything appeared to validate German planning. Visibility was poor. Snow reduced sightlines. Escorts were encountered as expected. Destroyers engaged. Smoke screens went up. German ships maneuvered confidently, believing they were operating in isolation. Then radar contacts appeared, not escorts. Cruisers. The appearance of HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica was not dramatic. There was no sudden reveal, no clear visual confirmation at first, only radar bearings and ranging data cutting through snow and haze. For German commanders, this was incomprehensible. The weather was supposed to prevent this. Yet British cruisers closed aggressively, firing accurately despite conditions. German gunnery, optimized for visual targeting, struggled. Shells fell wide. Fire control solutions degraded. The German plan depended on predictable British limitations. Those limitations no longer existed. The engagement quickly turned chaotic. Admiral Hipper took hits and suffered damage. German destroyers were forced to disengage. The expected annihilation of the convoy never materialized. Instead, the Germans found themselves outmaneuvered, outsensed, and exposed. The weather they trusted had not blinded the enemy. It had blinded only them. As the engagement unfolded, German command faced an unacceptable reality. The trap had failed, and the fleet was now vulnerable. Lozo, positioned to intercept merchant ships, failed to engage effectively. British escorts delayed and disrupted German movements just long enough for cruisers to dominate the battle space. The Germans disengaged. The convoy survived. From a purely material standpoint, the losses were minimal. But the psychological impact was enormous. German surface forces had failed, again. To destroy an Arctic convoy, despite numerical and firepower advantages, and despite conditions they believed favored them. The weather had not saved them. It had betrayed their assumptions. The Battle of the Barents Sea marked a turning point, not because of ships sunk, but because of confidence shattered. German naval leadership had believed weather was a force multiplier, that it could be trusted to shape the battle space predictably, that Allied response times were bound by visibility. They were wrong. British radar, decentralized command, and willingness to operate aggressively in marginal conditions had rendered those assumptions obsolete. Within weeks, the consequences were severe. Adolf Hitler, already skeptical of surface fleet effectiveness, lost faith entirely. German surface raiders were increasingly restricted. Major units were sidelined. Naval strategy shifted defensively, conceding initiative at sea, all because a fleet trusted a weather report more than an adaptable enemy. The Battle of the Barents Sea was over within hours. Its consequences lasted for the rest of the war. From a purely tactical perspective, the engagement seemed almost inconsequential. No capital ships were sunk, casualties were limited. The Allied convoy JW-51B reached the Soviet Union largely intact, delivering its cargo of tanks, aircraft, and supplies. But in Berlin, the reaction was explosive. German Naval Command had promised success under ideal conditions. The weather had been forecast to favor German surface action. The operation had been carefully planned, conservatively executed, and launched with a force that, on paper, outgunned the British escorts. And it had still failed. This failure struck at the heart of the Kriegsmarine's surface warfare doctrine. Since 1941, German surface operations had depended on windows, narrow moments when weather, darkness, and surprise could neutralize Allied numerical superiority. The Arctic, cold, dark, and often storm-lashed, was seen as the last environment where this doctrine still worked. The Barents Sea shattered that belief. German commanders realized something deeply unsettling. Weather was no longer a constraint on Allied response. It was now a constraint on German assumptions. British radar-equipped cruisers had maneuvered, targeted, and fired effectively in conditions German planners believed would prevent such actions. The weather had not slowed the enemy, it had concealed him. This inversion mattered. Every future German surface sortie would now face an impossible question. If weather cannot protect us, what can? The answer was nothing. The most damaging outcome of the battle did not occur at sea. It occurred in Hitler's headquarters. When reports reached Adolf Hitler that German heavy cruisers had failed to destroy a lightly defended convoy, despite favorable conditions, his reaction was fury mixed with vindication. He had long distrusted the surface fleet, viewing it as a costly prestige project that failed to deliver decisive results. The Barents Sea confirmed his worst suspicions. Within days, Hitler ordered severe restrictions on surface fleet operations. Plans for future Arctic sorties were curtailed. Capital ships were increasingly confined to port. Resources were diverted away from surface warfare and towards submarines and coastal defense. For the Kriegsmarine, this was devastating. Surface commanders lost strategic freedom. Initiative disappeared. Even when opportunities arose later, the institutional confidence to exploit them was gone. This was not merely punishment, it was abandonment. The German surface fleet would never again mount a serious offensive operation against Allied convoys in the Arctic. The weather, once their ally, had betrayed them. And Hitler concluded that no environmental advantage could compensate for Allied adaptability. The irony was brutal. The German ships had done exactly what was asked of them. They had trusted the forecast. They had followed the plan. They had acted cautiously. And in doing so, they had triggered the end of their own relevance. British naval leadership drew a very different conclusion. For them, the battle validated years of investment in radar integration, decentralized command, and weather-agnostic operations. The Royal Navy had deliberately trained crews to fight blind, to trust instruments over visibility, and to assume the enemy would attempt to exploit environmental assumptions. The Barents Sea confirmed that approach. From that point forward, Allied convoy protection doctrine shifted decisively. Escorts were reinforced not only based on enemy presence, but on forecasted weather, with the assumption that poor conditions increased the likelihood of enemy action rather than reduced it. Weather was no longer a shield. It was a signal. This change echoed across theaters. Surface groups learned to hide within storms. Carrier aircraft trained for marginal conditions. Radar-directed gunnery became standard. The Allies did not become immune to weather. They became comfortable inside it. The deeper legacy of this story is not about meteorology. It is about assumptions. The German plan failed not because the forecast was wrong, but because it was trusted as a determinant rather than a variable. German commanders assumed that weather constrained everyone equally. The British understood that constraint is asymmetric. Those who prepare to operate in poor conditions gain advantage over those who rely on them for protection. Modern military doctrine still reflects this lesson. Weather, terrain, and environment are now treated as contested domains, not neutral backdrops. Forces are trained to operate where the enemy believes they cannot, and to expect contact precisely when conditions appear unfavorable. The Barents Sea taught that lesson early and brutally. This story begins with confidence, a forecast that promised concealment, a plan that accounted for known risks, a fleet that believed nature itself was on its side. And it ends with something far more damaging than loss. It ends with disbelief. The German commanders at the Barents Sea did not fail because they ignored intelligence. They failed because they trusted it too completely, without considering how the enemy might interpret the same information differently. The British did not defeat them with surprise or superior numbers. They defeated them by refusing to be constrained by assumptions the Germans believed were universal. Weather did not make the battle possible. Expectation did. World War II is often remembered as a contest of machines and manpower. But again and again, its decisive moments turned on interpretation, on who understood not just the environment, but how the enemy thought about the environment. At the Barents Sea, one side trusted the forecast, the other trusted adaptability. Only one of those approaches survived the war. If you appreciate deep, documentary-grade World War II history that explores how assumptions, not just weapons, shaped the outcome of the war, consider liking this video and subscribing. These stories are built from operational records, battle reports, and post-war analysis, focusing on the quiet decisions that changed entire campaigns.